The registry station hung in the black of space, like a cathedral made of glass and steel, spinning so slowly that the stars behind it seemed to breathe. And Ethan Mercer stood at the entrance, holding the hand of the woman he loved, while his heart beat so hard he was sure the entire station could hear it. He had rehearsed his vows 6 times on the shuttle ride over, whispering them under his breath like a schoolboy practicing for a play, and every time he stumbled on the same line, because he could never quite find the right words for what Valeth meant to him. Not in English, not in Galactic Common, not in any language he had ever learned in his 34 years of breathing and stumbling through the universe. Valeth walked beside him, and she was beautiful in the way that a sunrise on an ocean world was beautiful. Not something you could describe, only something you could stand in front of and feel your chest go tight. Her skin shimmered with soft blue and violet light, the bioluminescence of her people, rippling across her in waves that matched her mood. And today, that light was dim, flickering at the edges like a candle in a draft. He noticed, but said nothing, because he thought she was nervous, and he was nervous too. And that felt normal for 2 people about to bind their lives together in front of a galactic bureaucrat. They had been together for 2 years, meeting first at a refueling station in Valari space, where Ethan's battered freight ship had limped in with a cracked coolant line and a prayer, and Valeth had been there on some diplomatic errand she never fully explained. He remembered the way she had looked at him across the crowded docking bay, not with the usual alien curiosity or the faint disgust some species showed humans, but with something warm and startled, like she had recognized someone she had been waiting to meet. Everything after that had been simple in the way that real love is simple, not easy, but clear. They talked for hours, across subspace channels. They met when their routes crossed. They learned each other's languages and habits and fears, and somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped thinking of her as an alien and started thinking of her as home. Now they stood in the great hall of the registry station, a circular chamber of white stone and humming light, and Concord Arbiter Giles waited for them at the center, an ancient being of a species Ethan could not name, tall and thin as a dead tree, with 6 eyes that blinked in sequence, and a voice like wind through a pipe organ. "State your names and species for the concordance record," Giles said, and his tone carried all the excitement of someone reading a grocery list. "Ethan James Mercer, human, Earth origin, Sol system," Ethan said, and he squeezed Vale's hand. "Valeth, of the Sisterhood of the Pale Drift. Valari, 4th born of 9, Vale said, and her voice was steady, but her light dimmed another shade. Zale entered the information into the floating console before him, his long fingers moving like spider legs across the controls. And for a moment, everything was quiet, except for the soft hum of the station, and the distant sound of other species moving through the corridors beyond the chamber walls. Then the console chimed. Not a pleasant chime, but a sharp clinical tone that made Ethan think of alarms and error messages. And Zale paused. His 6 eyes narrowed one by one from left to right, and he leaned forward to read something on the display. And then he leaned back and looked at them both, with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been amusement. With a face like his, it was hard to tell. "There is a complication," Giles said. Ethan felt Vale's hand tighten around his, and when he looked at her, her light had gone almost completely dark, just the faintest flicker of pale violet at her fingertips. And he knew in that moment that whatever was coming, she had known about it before they walked through the door. "Codex Article 7742, Giles continued, pulling the text up on a display that floated between them like a glowing page torn from some enormous book, "governs the bonding of individuals to members of recognized collective species, species in which individuals exist as part of a legally defined unit rather than as singular beings." Ethan stared at the floating text and understood none of it. The Velari sisterhoods are classified as collective units under the Concordance, Giles said, and now there was definitely something like amusement in his voice, dry and ancient and patient as stone. Non-collective individual enters a formal bond with any member of a sisterhood. The bond extends, by law, to the entire sisterhood. The words hung in the air between them, and Ethan heard them, and his brain processed them, and then his brain processed them again, because surely he had misunderstood. "I'm sorry," he said. "Are you telling me that if I marry Vale, I'm also married to all 9 members of the Sisterhood of the Pale Drift?" Zale finished, and there it was, the faintest twitch at the corner of his thin mouth. He was absolutely amused. "That is correct. The law was established 4,000 years ago to accommodate several hive mind and collective species within the Concordance, and it has never been amended, because until this moment, no non-collective species has ever triggered it." Ethan turned to Vale. She would not look at him. Her light had gone completely dark, and in the white chamber she looked like a shadow of herself. And when she finally spoke, her voice cracked like thin ice. "I knew," she whispered. "I knew, and I could not tell you, because I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would leave. And I could not bear it, Ethan. I thought perhaps the law would not apply to humans. I hoped, I prayed to every light in the sky that the system would not flag it. But—" She stopped, and Ethan saw something he had never seen before. Velari tears. They were not like human tears, but drops of soft golden light that fell from her eyes and dissolved before they reached the floor. Tiny dying stars, born from grief. The chamber was very quiet. Zale cleared his throat, all 6 sections of it, and spoke again, with careful precision. "You have options, Captain Mercer. You may proceed with the bond under the full terms of Article 7742, accepting legal, social, and protective obligations to the entire Sisterhood of the Pale Drift, all 9 members. Alternatively, you may decline the bond entirely. There is no partial option available under the current law." "No partial option," Ethan repeated. "Correct. You cannot bond with one sister and not the others. The Sisterhood is one legal entity." Ethan stared at the floating text of the law, and the words blurred and sharpened and blurred again, and he thought about Vale. Quiet, gentle, luminous Vale, who had sat with him through engine repairs and bad coffee and long nights in deep space, and never once asked him to be anything other than what he was. He thought about the fact that she had 8 sisters he had never met. 8 women, beings, people, who had never agreed to this, who probably did not want this, who might hate the very idea of being bound to a clumsy human freighter captain from a backwater planet in a young and noisy species that the rest of the galaxy considered barely civilized. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. 30 standard days, Zale said, "after which the application expires, and you must begin the process again if you wish to proceed." Ethan nodded, and the motion felt mechanical, and then he thanked Zale, because even when his world was turning upside down, Ethan Mercer was the kind of man who said thank you, and he walked out of the chamber with Vale beside him, her golden tears still falling in silence. He found the observation deck on the station's upper ring, a long curved room with a wall of glass that looked out at the stars, and he sat down on the cold metal bench and stared at the infinite dark and tried to make his thoughts stop spinning. His communicator buzzed 20 minutes later. "Vale's frequency." He answered. "I understand if you want to leave," she said, and her voice was small and broken, and her words came wrapped in the sound of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. "I should have told you, and I did not, and that was wrong, and if you hate me, Vale," he said, and his voice was rough but steady. "I need you to stop talking and listen to me for a second, okay?" Silence. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and he meant it the way humans mean things. Not with logic or calculation, but with the raw, stubborn force of a heart that has decided something and will not be moved. "But I need to meet them. All of them. Every single one of your sisters. If I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do it right. And doing it right means knowing who I'm binding myself to. He heard her breath catch, and then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "You would do that?" she asked. "I would do anything for you," he said, and then after a pause, "But I'm going to need a bigger ship." She laughed, really laughed, and her light, even through the communicator's tiny screen, blazed back to life in brilliant shimmering blue. And Ethan smiled at the stars and wondered what exactly he had gotten himself into. 30 days, 9 sisters. One human heart that had never been very good at doing things the easy way. This was either going to be the greatest adventure of his life, or the most spectacular disaster in the history of human-alien relations. Probably both. Alari Prime was not what Ethan had expected, although if he was being honest with himself, he was not sure what he had expected. Maybe something cold and crystalline, sterile and perfect, like the inside of a jewelry box. What he found instead was a world that was alive in every direction, pulsing with color and movement and light. The cities were not built so much as grown, towers of living crystal that rose from the ground like enormous flowers, reaching for a sky that shifted between deep violet and pale gold, depending on the time of day. And between the towers ran rivers of bioluminescent water that cast moving patterns across every surface, so that the whole world seemed to breathe and shimmer. His freighter looked absolutely ridiculous, parked among the elegant Velari vessels at the landing platform. A dented, scarred, oil-stained block of human engineering, sitting between ships that looked like they had been sculpted from moonlight. And Ethan tried not to feel self-conscious as he walked down the ramp in his cleanest jacket, which still had a faint stain on the left sleeve from a coffee spill 3 weeks ago. Vale met him at the platform, and she was glowing brighter than he had ever seen her, but her light carried that nervous flicker he had learned to recognize. Quick pulses of white at her temples that meant she was worried. "They are waiting," she said. "All 9?" he asked. "All 9. Ethan took a breath and held it and let it go. "Then let's not keep them waiting." The ancestral hall of the Sisterhood of the Pale Drift sat at the top of one of the tallest crystal towers in the city. A vast circular room with walls that were almost transparent, letting in the light of the sky from every direction. And the floor was a single piece of polished stone that reflected everything above it like a dark mirror. They were arranged in a semicircle when Ethan entered. 9 Velari women, each one luminous and tall, and radiating the kind of quiet power that made the air feel heavier. And they watched him with eyes that glowed in different colors, and not a single one of them was smiling. Find out about the Velari on the journey here, their culture, their biology, their history, their customs, and he knew that a sisterhood was not like a human family. It was deeper than that. The 9 sisters shared a partial neural link from birth, a connection that let them feel echoes of each other's emotions, a faint, constant awareness of one another that humans had no equivalent for. And this meant that every sister in the room could feel what Vale felt for him, whether they wanted to or not. That thought made his palms sweat. The eldest sister stood at the center of the semicircle, and Ethan knew her name was Serendis, the first sister, the leader, the voice of the sisterhood. And she was magnificent in the worst possible way. Tall, even by Velari standards. Her light a cold and steady silver that did not flicker or pulse, but burned with the constant intensity of a star that had decided it would never go out. And her eyes were the color of winter and twice as warm. "So," Serendis said, and her voice filled the chamber without effort, "this is the human." "Ethan Mercer," he said, and he extended his hand in the human greeting before remembering that Velari did not shake hands. Skin contact was intimate for them, a transmission of emotional echoes. And he pulled his hand back awkwardly and tried to turn the motion into a wave, which was somehow worse. "Captain Mercer," Serendis continued as if he had not moved at all, "you should understand that this sisterhood did not consent to this bond. Our sister Valith made her choices without consulting us, and now we are all expected to accept the consequences of her affection." She said the word affection the way someone might say disease. The third sister stepped forward, and Ethan recognized her from Vale's descriptions. Thesara, the warrior scholar, broad-shouldered by Valari standards, with light that pulsed in aggressive reds and oranges, like a fire looking for something to burn. "I have a question for the human," Thesara said, and she looked at Ethan the way a hawk looks at something small moving in a field. "You live, what, 80 years? 90, if your medicine is good?" "About that," Ethan said. "We live 600, Thesara said. "You are asking us to bind ourselves to a being who will be dead before we have finished our 2nd century. What can you possibly offer us that is worth the grief of watching you wither and fade like a leaf?" The room was very still. Ethan felt the weight of 18 glowing eyes on him, and he felt the distance between himself and these ancient luminous beings who had been alive long before his grandparents were born, and would be alive long after his bones had turned to dust. And for a moment he almost agreed with Thesara. What could he possibly offer them? But then he thought of Vale, and he thought of the 2 years they had shared, and he thought of all the small moments that had meant everything. The way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she dimmed her light when she was sleepy, the way she had once stayed awake through an entire 40-hour engine repair just to keep him company. And he knew that the length of a life was not the same as the size of it. "I didn't come here to convince you," he said, and his voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "Here to listen. I know you didn't choose this, and I know you don't know me, and I know that from where you're standing, I probably look like a very short, very breakable mistake that your sister dragged home." A flicker of surprise moved through the semicircle, a ripple of light, across several sisters at once. "So I'm not going to make speeches," Ethan continued. "I'm not going to tell you why you should accept me, because that's not my decision to make. Instead, I want to ask each of you, one at a time, to tell me what you need me to understand about who you are." Silence. Serendis stared at him, and for the first time her silver light flickered, just once, just barely. "You want us to tell you about ourselves?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes. Valari males do not ask this," Thesara said, and her fire had dimmed slightly from hostility to something closer to confusion. "I'm not a Valari male," Ethan said. "I'm a human freight captain with a coffee stain on his jacket. And where I come from, you don't join a family by standing at the door and demanding to be let in. You sit down and you learn people's names, and you ask them how they take their coffee." Linove, the 7th sister, youngest in spirit if not in years, her light a playful green that danced and flickered, like sunlight through leaves, tilted her head and spoke for the first time. "What is coffee?" And despite everything, despite the cold stares and the hostile questions and the crushing weight of what he was trying to do, Ethan laughed, and the sound of it bounced off the crystal walls and filled the chamber with something warm and unexpected and entirely human. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll bring some tomorrow, and you can try it for yourself." Linove's green light brightened, and she smiled, the first smile any sister besides Vale had given him. It was not much, but it was a start. That night, after the formal meeting had ended, and the sisters had dispersed to their separate quarters within the tower, Vale came to the small guest room where Ethan had been placed, a room clearly designed for Valari visitors, with a bed that was too long and too narrow, and a ceiling that glowed with soft ambient light. She stood in the doorway, and her light was a complicated mix of hope and fear and gratitude and guilt. Paint in water. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Ask them who they are. No one has ever done that, not for a sisterhood. People assume they already know us because they can see our light, but light is only the surface." Ethan reached out his hand to her, and she took it, and the moment their skin touched, she felt what he felt, the way Valerie always did with direct contact. And what she felt was not fear or regret or obligation, but a steady, stubborn warmth that said, "I am here, and I am not leaving." "You're worth all of this," he said, "and if they're part of you, then they're worth knowing." Her light blazed, a brilliant shimmering blue that filled the room and spilled out through the doorway into the corridor beyond. And somewhere in the tower, through the faint threads of the neural link, 8 other sisters felt an echo of something they had never felt before. Something human. The labyrinth opened like a wound in the ground. A vast circular pit carved into the living crystal of Valari Prime. And from its depths rose a light that shifted and pulsed like the heartbeat of something enormous and sleeping. And Ethan stood at the edge looking down and thought to himself that this was probably the stupidest thing he had ever agreed to do. Thessara had challenged him 3 days after his arrival. Standing in the middle of the Sisterhood's training hall, with her red-orange light blazing, and her arms crossed, and her voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from 600 years of never being wrong. "If you want to understand us," she had said, "then walk the labyrinth of echoes. Every Valari walks it before their 2nd century. It tests the truth of what you are, not what you say you are." "And if I fail," Ethan had asked, "then we will know that you are not strong enough for this sisterhood." He had not hesitated before saying yes, which was either courage or stupidity. And after 34 years of being Ethan Mercer, he was no longer sure there was a difference. Now he stood at the edge, in the pale gold light of the Valari morning, wearing simple clothes and carrying nothing, because the rules of the labyrinth allowed nothing. No tools, no weapons, no technology, no communication devices, just the walker and whatever they carried inside themselves. Vale had tried to prepare him as best she could, explaining that the labyrinth was a living thing, a structure of bioluminescent crystal that responded to the emotional state of whoever walked through it, shifting its walls and pathways based on what it sensed, creating barriers from fear and openings from calm, navigated it through their neural link, feeling the echoes of other sisters who had walked before them, following emotional trails like breadcrumbs through the shifting maze. Ethan had no neural link. He had no bioluminescence. He had no 600-year-old instincts for reading living crystal. What he had was a stubborn heart, and a pair of boots that had walked him through worse situations, and a glowing hole in the ground, probably. "Begin," Thessara said, and Ethan stepped off the edge and into the light. The labyrinth swallowed him immediately, the walls rising up around him in towering columns of crystal that pulsed with deep blue and violet light. And the path beneath his feet was smooth and warm, and seemed to vibrate with a low hum that he felt more in his chest than his ears. And within 30 seconds he was completely and thoroughly lost. The walls shifted constantly, sliding and reforming in response to his presence. Changed with them, when his heartbeat quickened with anxiety, the crystals around him pulsed red, and the walls seemed to close in, and when he forced himself to breathe slowly and calm down, they shifted to cooler blues, and the path widened. And Ethan realized with a kind of amazed horror that the labyrinth was reading him like an open book. He walked for what felt like hours, turning at random when paths forked, doubling back when walls appeared in front of him, and the labyrinth tested him in ways he had not expected, not with physical obstacles, but with emotional ones. At one point, the light around him shifted to a warm golden hue that was exactly the color of sunlight on Earth, and he was hit with a wave of homesickness so powerful it nearly drove him to his knees, and the walls responded by closing in tight around him, until he was standing in a space barely wide enough to turn around. He stood there in that golden trap and breathed, and he let himself feel the homesickness instead of fighting it, because fighting it would only make the walls tighter. And he whispered, "I miss you," to a planet that was 10,000 light-years away. And then he kept walking. The labyrinth threw fear at him next, a section where the light went completely dark, and the floor dropped away beneath his feet, and he was falling for one horrible second before his boots hit solid ground again, and the walls erupted in violent red, shapes moving in the crystal that looked like faces screaming, and his heart hammered and his hands shook, but he kept walking. Only way out was through. He walked through loneliness so acute it made his teeth ache, and through anger that came from nowhere and burned hot behind his eyes, and through a sadness that sat on his chest like a stone. And through each one he did the only thing he knew how to do. He felt it, he named it, he let it pass, and he put one foot in front of the other. Somewhere in the middle of the labyrinth, or what he hoped was the middle, the light changed to something he had never seen before. A color that had no name in any human language. Something between silver and violet and the feeling of being held. And in that light he saw a veil, or not saw her exactly, but felt her. A warmth at the edge of his awareness that was not the neural link, because he did not have one, but was something else entirely. Memory, maybe, or love, or just the stubborn insistence of a human heart that refuses to forget what matters. He followed that feeling like a compass needle following north. When he finally emerged from the other side of the labyrinth, the gold light of morning had turned to the deep violet of Valari evening, and all 9 sisters were standing at the exit, waiting for him. And he was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, where he had walked into a crystal wall he had not seen, and his clothes were soaked with sweat, and his legs were shaking so badly that each step was an act of pure willpower. But he was laughing. He stumbled out of the labyrinth, and stood in the evening air and laughed, with his hands on his knees, and his whole body trembling. And the sisters stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to bewilderment. "Why are you laughing?" Thessara demanded. Ethan looked up at her with blood on his face and joy in his eyes, and said, "Because it was beautiful in there. Terrible, but beautiful." And the sisters went quiet, because that was one of the oldest Valari sayings, the unity of pain and wonder. Belief that suffering and beauty were 2 sides of the same light. And this human, who had no link and no glow and no centuries of wisdom, had stumbled into the heart of their philosophy by accident. Or maybe not by accident at all. Over the days that followed, the other tests came, smaller ones, informal, the kind of challenges that families give to strangers to see what they are made of. One sister asked him to cook, and he made a simple beef stew from supplies he had brought on his ship, because he could not eat most Valari food, and they certainly could not eat his. And the sisters watched him work with fascination, because Valari did not use heat to prepare food. They used bioluminescent enzymes, and the sight of a human standing over an open flame stirring a pot was as exotic to them as a magic ritual. Linove tasted the stew first, because Linove always went first when something was new and strange, and her eyes went wide, and her green light flared so bright it lit up the entire kitchen, and she said, "It burns, but I cannot stop eating it," which Ethan decided to take as a compliment. Another sister, Melindris, the 5th, a quiet being whose light was a deep, steady indigo, asked him about death. She said it gently, but directly, in the way Valari always were, and she wanted to know how humans lived with the knowledge that their time was so short. Ethan thought about it for a long time before answering. "We don't live with it," he said. "We live because of it. Every good meal tastes better because there's a last one coming, and every sunrise is more beautiful because you know you only get a certain number, and every person you love is more precious because you know you can't hold on forever. Melindris's indigo light shifted to something warmer, and she said nothing, but she nodded in a way that said she understood, even if she could never fully feel it. Then came the night that changed everything. Thessera found Ethan alone on the lower terrace of the tower, and her light was burning hot and angry, and she stood in front of him and demanded to know the truth. "Why won't you leave?" she said. "You have seen what we are. 9 women you do not know. 9 lives you cannot share. 9 minds you cannot touch. You have no link, no light, no place in our world. Why do you keep staying when any reasonable being would have walked away?" And Ethan, who had been patient and calm and measured for days, who had smiled through hostility and laughed through pain, and answered every question with grace, Ethan broke. "Because I have nowhere else to go," he said, and his voice cracked, and the words came flooding out of him, like water through a broken dam. "Because I grew up on a colony that failed, and I watched my mother work herself to death, keeping us alive, and I lost friends to the vacuum and to bad luck, and to the 1,000 ways the universe kills people who don't have anyone watching out for them, and for 20 years I flew alone through the black, carrying cargo for people who didn't know my name. And then I met Vale, and she saw me. Not what I could do for her. Not what species I was. Not how long I would last. Just me." His eyes were wet and his hands were shaking, and he was not performing for anyone. He was just a man standing in front of a stranger, telling her the truth, because he had nothing left to hide behind. "I'm not staying because I'm stubborn," he said. "I'm staying because she's the first home I've had since I was 12 years old. And if the price of that home is learning to love 8 women I've never met, then I will pay it gladly, because she is worth it. You are all worth it, even if you never believe that." Through the Neuralink, every sister in the tower felt the Sara's shock, as it mingled with the raw wave of Ethan's grief and love that crashed through the brief moment of skin contact when he had grabbed her wrist without thinking. And for 3 seconds, all 9 sisters felt what a human heart sounds like when it stops pretending to be brave. Silence fell across them. Sisterhood like snow. Later that evening, Lineve found Ethan on the upper balcony, staring at the stars with red eyes and a tired smile. And she sat beside him, and without a word she reached out and placed her hand on his. The first voluntary skin contact any sister besides Vale had ever offered him. Through her palm she felt him. Exhaustion, fear, loneliness, and underneath it all, a love so fierce and stubborn and unreasonable that it made her light stutter and flare. "Oh," she whispered, and her green light softened to something like awe. "So this is what she feels." And in the shadows of the corridor behind them, Cyrendis stood watching, with her silver light burning steady. And no one saw the moment when that light, just barely, just for a heartbeat, shifted toward warmth. The summons arrived on a morning that had been, until that moment, almost peaceful. Ethan drinking coffee on the terrace, while Lineve sat beside him, trying to understand why humans voluntarily consumed a bitter brown liquid that made their hearts beat faster, and Thessara sharpening a training blade nearby while pretending not to listen to their conversation. And for a few quiet minutes, the tower had felt like something close to home. Then Cyrendis appeared in the doorway, with her silver light burning cold and hard, and she held a crystalline tablet in her hand, and the expression on her face was the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. "The luminous purity has filed a formal challenge against the bond," she said. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ethan did not know the luminous purity by name, but he had heard whispers during his weeks on Velare Prime, a conservative faction that believed in the separation of species, in the separation of dons, preservation of Velare bloodlines and traditions, in the idea that some things were sacred and should not be touched by outside hands. They had existed for centuries on the fringes of Velare politics, but the news of a human bonding with a sisterhood had given them something they had not had in a long time: A cause. What does that mean? Ethan asked, setting down his coffee. It means they are arguing before the Galactic Tribunal that our bond is a corruption of Codex Article 7742, Serendis said. They claim that humans are biologically incompatible with collective bonding, and that allowing this precedent will degrade the legal framework that protects collective species across the concordance. And if they win, the bond is annulled and a new restriction is placed on all future cross-species unions involving collective species and non-collective individuals. Ethan sat very still for a moment, and then he said, "So this isn't just about us." "No," Serendis said. "This is about every species that has ever loved across the boundaries that the concordance drew. If they win here, they close a door that can never be opened again." The tribunal was held in the Grand Concord Hall, a structure so vast that it had its own weather system. Clouds formed near the ceiling, thin and luminous, drifting above the assembled representatives of dozens of species who filled the tiered galleries like a living rainbow of forms and colors and lights. Ethan had never felt so small in his life. He sat at the respondents' platform, with Vale beside him, and the rest of the sisterhood arranged behind them, 9 points of light in a sea of alien faces. And across the chamber, the luminous purity delegation stood at their own platform, 3 Valari whose light burned with the pure white intensity of beings who had never doubted themselves for a single moment of their long lives. The lead representative was called Solvane, and she was ancient even by Valari standards. Her light so bright it was almost painful to look at, and she spoke with the kind of authority that comes from believing absolutely that you are right. The concordance was built on the principle that each species has the right to preserve its nature, Solvane began, addressing the tribunal panel, a collection of 12 judges from 12 different species. Codex Article 7742 was written to protect collective species, to ensure that their bonds are recognized and respected in full. It was never intended to be exploited by an individual of a non-collective species, seeking to insert himself into a unit he can never truly be part of. She turned her burning gaze toward Ethan. "Humans do not share neural links," she continued. "They do not feel what their partners feel. They do not carry the weight of collective consciousness. They are, by their very biology, incapable of the kind of bonding that Article 7742 was designed to protect. Allowing this bond to stand is not an act of inclusion, but an act of dilution, a weakening of the very concept of collective unity." The chamber murmured with the sound of 100 different species processing her words, and Ethan felt the truth in some of what she said, like a knife between his ribs, because she was right. He could not feel what the sisters felt. He could not share their link. He could not glow with their light. And for a terrible moment, he wondered if he had been fooling himself all along. Then Vale's hand found his under the platform, and her skin was warm, and through the contact, he felt her steady certainty flowing into him like sunlight, and the doubt retreated. When it was his turn to speak, Ethan stood, and the Grand Concord Hall fell quiet, and 100 species looked at this small, opaque, short-lived creature, and waited. He did not argue law, because he was not a lawyer. He did not argue biology, because he was not a scientist. He talked about people. "I've spent the last several weeks living with the Sisterhood of the Pale Drift," he said, and his voice carried in the vast chamber, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. "And I want to tell you what I learned, not about Valari culture, or neural links, or collective bonding theory, but about 9 people." He looked at the sisterhood behind him. "Serendis leads not because she wants power, but because she cannot bear the thought of her sisters facing anything without her standing in front of them. She stays awake longer than anyone else in the tower, because she checks on each sister before she sleeps, and she thinks no one notices, but they all do." Serendis's silver light flickered. "Thesara is not angry. She is afraid. She is afraid of anything that might hurt the people she loves. And she expresses that fear as strength, because she learned a long time ago that the universe respects teeth more than tears. And underneath all that fire, she is the most protective soul I have ever met. Thesara's red light dimmed to something softer. Lineve sees wonder in everything, in coffee, in human music, in the way stars look different from every angle. And she reminds every sister in that tower that the universe is still capable of surprising them, even after centuries of living in it. Lineve's green light danced. He went on, naming each sister, describing not their biology or their link or their species, but their individual hearts, the things that made each one of them irreplaceable, the quiet truths he had learned not through any neural connection, but through the painfully human process of paying attention and asking questions and caring enough to remember the answers. Have a neural link, he said. I can't feel what they feel. I can't share their light. I will be gone long before any of them reach the middle of their lives. Representative Solvane is right about all of that. He paused. But I chose to learn them the human way, by showing up, by listening, by staying even when it was hard, by earning trust one conversation at a time. I cannot feel their emotions through a link, but I can see when Serendis is tired and bring her tea. I can hear when Thesara's voice tightens and know she needs space. I can notice when Lineve goes quiet and understand that she is thinking about something beautiful. He looked at the tribunal. Humans don't bond through biology. We bond through choice. Every single day, we wake up and choose the people we love, not because a link compels us, but because our hearts decide. And that choice made freely, made daily, made in full knowledge that we will die and lose everything. That choice is the strongest bond I know. The chamber was silent. Somewhere in the upper galleries, a Thekri delegate, a member of one of the most solitary species in the Concordance, a being who had never bonded with anyone in 400 years of life, leaned to his companion and muttered, "Humans are insane, magnificent but insane." Then Serendis stood. She had not been called to speak. She simply rose from her seat behind Ethan, with her silver light blazing, and the chamber turned to look at her, and she walked to the center of the platform and faced the tribunal with the bearing of a queen. "I did not want this bond," she said, and her voice was clear as crystal. "I resented the human who triggered it, and the sister who brought him to us, and the law that forced us together. I have made my opposition known at every opportunity, and I stand here now, not as someone who was persuaded, but as someone who was proven wrong." She turned to look at Ethan, and her silver light, cold, hard, unwavering Serendis, softened. "This human has done what no Velari male, no being of any species, has ever done for the sisterhood of the Pale Drift. He asked us who we were, and he listened. He did not demand our acceptance. He earned it, one sister at a time, one act of stubborn, impossible kindness at a time." She faced the tribunal again. "The Sisterhood of the Pale Drift stands with Ethan Mercer. We claim him as ours, and we offer ourselves as his, and if the Concordance would break this bond, then it must break us first." Behind her, one by one, 8 other lights flared, red and green and indigo and gold and every color between, until the respondents' platform blazed with 9 points of living fire, and the message was unmistakable. The tribunal deliberated for less than an hour. The bond was upheld, the challenge was dismissed, and a new annotation was added to Codex Article 7742. Recognizing that collective bonding could be achieved not only through neural linkage, but through sustained emotional commitment, and that the capacity for such commitment was not limited to any single species. When they walked out of the Grand Concord Hall into the light of the Concordance capital's triple suns, Thesara approached Ethan, and she placed both hands on his shoulders, a Velari gesture of deep respect, usually reserved for warriors who had proven themselves in battle. And she looked at him with eyes that burned like embers, and she said nothing. She did not need to. Ethan put his hand over hers and nodded, and that was enough. 6 months had passed since the tribunal, and Ethan Mercer's life looked nothing like it had before. Which was funny, because in many ways, it looked exactly the same. He still flew freight routes through the deep black. He still drank too much coffee. He still talked to his ship like it could hear him. But now when he came home, there were 9 lights waiting for him instead of silence. And that made all the difference in the universe. The Sisterhood's tower had changed in small ways that visitors might not notice, but that Ethan noticed every single day. There was a human-sized chair on the terrace now, shorter and wider than the elegant Velari furniture, with a cushion that Lenove had insisted on covering with a fabric that changed color based on temperature, because she thought it was hilarious that humans radiated so much heat. There was a kitchen shelf stocked with human food next to the Velari enzyme preparations. There was a coffee machine, a real one, imported at absurd expense from Earth, that had become the most controversial object in the tower, because half the sisters had developed an alarming addiction to caffeine. Ethan's mornings began the same way every day. He would wake up in the room he shared with Vale, a room they had redesigned together so that it was neither fully human nor fully Velari, but something new, with warm blankets on a Velari sleeping platform and soft ambient light that Vale adjusted to match the colors of a sunset on Earth, because she knew it made him feel peaceful. And he would walk to the terrace with his coffee and watch the Velari sky shift from violet to gold, and wait for the tower to wake up around him. Vale was always the first to join him, her blue light steady and warm in the morning air, and she would sit beside him and lean her head against his shoulder. And in those quiet moments before the day began, Ethan would feel the full weight of what his life had become and marvel at the impossible luck of it. She did not dim with guilt anymore. Her light was clear and bright and constant, and when she looked at him, it was with the kind of love that has survived being tested and come out stronger on the other side. Not the fragile hope of someone afraid of being abandoned, but the steady radiance of someone who knows she is home. Serendis would appear next, always with a tablet in her hand, already working, her silver light cool and precise in the morning air. And she would nod at Ethan in a way that contained an entire conversation. I see you, I acknowledge you, do not expect me to be warm about it. And he would pour her a cup of coffee without being asked, and she would take it without thanking him. And this was their ritual, and they both understood that it meant more than words. Over time, Ethan had come to know Serendis better than almost anyone, and what he had found beneath the ice was not coldness, but vigilance, a leader who had carried the weight of 8 other lives for centuries, and who had never once been able to set that weight down. On the nights when the political pressures from outside became too heavy, Serendis would find Ethan on the terrace, and they would sit in silence together. And he learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was simply be present, without demanding anything in return. Thesara had become something Ethan had never expected to have, a best friend. Their relationship was built on argument and competition, and a mutual respect that expressed itself through insults and challenges, and it was the most fun Ethan had had in years. She taught him Velari combat forms, elegant flowing patterns of movement that his human body performed with all the grace of a brick rolling downhill. And he taught her human boxing, which she called barbaric, and then practiced obsessively every morning. They sparred 3 times a week, and he had never once beaten her, and she had never once let him quit. And somewhere in the space between those 2 facts lived a friendship that neither of them would ever have predicted. Lenove remained the most openly delighted by Ethan's presence. She had thrown herself into the study of human culture with the enthusiasm of a child discovering a new toy. And her latest obsession was music. She had spent months listening to everything from classical symphonies to rock to jazz to the strange atonal compositions of the 23rd century. and she had begun composing her own pieces. Valari human fusion music that combined the bioluminescent harmonics of her people with human melody and rhythm. The result was unlike anything anyone in the galaxy had ever heard. And when she played it in the tower's common room, all 9 sisters and 1 human would sit together in the shifting light and listen. And the music would fill the space between them, like a bridge made of sound. And Ethan would look around at this impossible family and feel his chest go tight in the best possible way. The other sisters had each found their own rhythm with him as well. Melindris shared his love of silence and stargazing, and they often sat together on the observation platform, speaking maybe 10 words in an hour, and both finding it deeply satisfying. Corathe, the 6th sister, was an engineer at heart, and she and Ethan spent countless hours in the freighter's engine bay, her elegant bioluminescent tools working alongside his battered human wrenches. And she had improved his ship's efficiency by 40%, while he had taught her 17 creative uses for duct tape. Yenvalis and Prethia, the 8th and 9th sisters, were twins of a sort, born at the same moment, their lights identical shades of warm amber. And they had adopted Ethan with a quiet fierceness that expressed itself in making sure he ate enough and slept enough and did not work himself to collapse the way humans apparently tended to do. And then there was Dianthe, the 2nd sister, who had been the last to accept him, not out of hostility, but out of a profound shyness that Ethan had learned to navigate with patience and gentleness. She was a poet and a historian, and when she finally shared her writing with him, it was like being handed a key to a room that had been locked for a very long time. And he had read every word with the careful attention it deserved, and she had wept her golden light tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming experience of being truly seen. The galaxy was watching all of this with fascination. The tribunal ruling had sent ripples across the concordance, and the Sisterhood of the Pale Drift had become famous, the first cross-species collective bond in recorded history, a living precedent for what was possible when the old laws met new kinds of love. Some species celebrated it as progress, while others condemned it as an aberration, and the debate raged across 1,000 worlds in 1,000 languages. Ethan did his best to stay out of the politics, but the universe had other plans. A young human woman named Sarah contacted him through the public channels, her voice nervous and her words tumbling over each other, and she told him that she had fallen in love with a member of a Thekri collective, a species even more reclusive than the Valari, and she was terrified of what the bonding would mean and how the collective would react, and whether she was strong enough. Ethan listened to her the way he had listened to every sister in the tower, with patience and attention and the kind of quiet kindness that costs nothing and means everything. And when she was done talking, he gave her the advice he wished someone had given him at the beginning. "Don't try to be what they are," he said. "Be what you are and give it everything. You don't need a neural link to love somebody. You just need to show up every day and choose them. And that's harder than any link, because it's a choice you have to make again every morning. But it's also more beautiful, because it's free." She thanked him with tears in her voice, and Ethan ended the call and sat for a long time, thinking about how strange life was, how a freight captain with a coffee stain on his jacket had somehow become a symbol of something bigger than himself. Night fell on Valari Prime, and the sky shifted to the deep impossible black that only alien worlds could produce. A black so pure it made the stars look like they had been painted on with light. And Ethan sat on the balcony of the tower that had become his home, his legs stretched out, and his coffee growing cold in his hands, and his heart full of a quiet contentment he had never known was possible. One by one they came. Serendis first, her silver light cool and steady as a moon, taking the seat to his left without a word. Then Thesara, her fire dimmed to warm embers, settling against the railing, with her arms crossed and a look on her face that dared anyone to call this moment sentimental. Linove arrived humming one of her new compositions, her green light dancing as she sat cross-legged on the floor. And Melindris followed like her shadow, her indigo glow peaceful and deep. And Corythe came still wiping engine grease from her fingers. And Yenvalis and Prethia arrived together as they always did, their twin amber lights perfectly synchronized. And Dianthe slipped in last among them, quiet as a whisper, her light a soft rose that grew stronger in the company of her sisters. And then Vale. She crossed the balcony and sat beside him, close enough that their arms touched, and her blue light mingled with the silver and red and green and indigo and steel and amber and rose, until the balcony was alive with color, 9 distinct lights, creating something together that none of them could make alone. The stars turned above them, ancient and patient. "You know," Ethan said, "when Zale read that law, I thought my life was over." Vale turned to look at him, and her light was the brightest he had ever seen it, a brilliant shimmering blue that held every hope and fear and joy of the last 2 years in its depths. "And now?" she asked. Ethan looked around the balcony at the 9 lights that surrounded him, fierce Thesara, and steady Serendis, and curious Linove, and quiet Melindris, and clever Corythe, and protective Yenvalis, and Prethia, and gentle Dianthe, and luminous, beloved Vale. And he smiled the way humans smile when their hearts are so full that the feeling spills out through every part of their face. "Now I think it was the best law in the galaxy," he said, and 9 lights blazed brighter. Across the stars, species with millennia of civilization had always believed that connection required shared minds, shared blood, shared biology, that the deepest bonds could only form between those who were made from the same light. It took a single human, stubborn, fragile, and unreasonably full of love, to prove that sometimes all it required was the willingness to show up and stay. The balcony glowed with 10 lights now, 9 that shimmered and pulsed and danced, and 1 that did not glow at all, except in the way that mattered most, the way that burned from the inside, the way that chose every single day to stay.